said, I'm Maggie Englar. Just for a little bit of personal background about why I'm giving this talk. I did my degrees at Stanford, decided I really liked the sort of stats and data science part of working, and I've been in cybersecurity a few years now, most recently as a data scientist at Duo, and that is some work that I did while there will be the subject of this talk on the state of authentication. So this is maybe more true or less true depending on the nature of this practice, but I would say it's fair to say that in general, security practitioners are sort of on the frontier of secure authentication. So just a show of hands, how many people here do use multi-factor authentication? Okay, almost I think maybe everyone. How many people have security keys? Okay, still a very large portion. And I think one of the things that affects us as we go about day-to-day thinking about how to achieve the closest thing to perfect security that we can is a disconnect between our coworkers, our peers, and the general public. So here's just like sort of an example about how different second factors of authentication work. Against bulk phishing attacks, so this is a study that Google did, sort of a large-scale natural experiment with hundreds of thousands of their accounts. The accounts that had protected with SMS two-factor, that second factor was 96% effective against bulk phishing attacks. On-device prompts, like Duo Push, were 99% effective. And security keys were 100% effective. And then again, with targeted phishing attacks, you see SMS fall to only 76% effective. On-device prompts were 90% effective with the targeted attack, and security keys remained 100% effective. So looking at these numbers, these are still, even in the targeted phishing attack scenario, these are still pretty impressive as far as the security mitigation goes. And this might lead us to say, well, this mitigation is clearly an enormously effective security control. So, like, why do we still need to worry about two-factor authentication? This is part of our normal workflow. But again, for a lot of people, it's not. And so what about people who don't know or don't think about two-factor? Well, we asked them. So in the summer of last year, 2019, Duo Labs collected a Census representative survey. I'll go into more details about that later, of all things related to two-factor. What kind of two-factor authentication people had used, how they valued different accounts, and how that impacted their decision whether or not to enroll. As well as their experiences that they had in authenticating. Again, why run surveys? So the goal of this exercise was really to understand the opinion and experiences of a general population. So people who are removed from the day-to-day sort of high-level security work. And then another reason, we wanted to benchmark adoption as well as 2FA awareness in particular. So Duo, for one example, has been an MFA provider for years. And we wanted to make sure, or to see whether we were making progress, whether the word was getting out, whether more people were actually using two-factor authentication. We did a similar survey 2 years prior, so in 2017. And in this survey, we had 28% of all respondents who used 2FA. So that was sort of cited frequently, and you can still see that figure being cited today as a measure of general population two-factor adoption that really no one else had gone out and collected before that. So our survey in particular was examining populations from the United States and the United Kingdom. We were curious to see whether those would differ in any substantial ways. We had over 500 respondents from each. and each matched the demographics according to the latest census in key areas like gender, age, ethnicity, within a few percentage points as to the latest demographic data available. We ran this through a third-party vendor called Qualtrics, who sort of goes out and finds the sample for us, and then all respondents fill out an online questionnaire. If you don't remember anything else from today, this is probably a great slide to remember. So one of the biggest, most important results out of this survey was very good news for us, is that 53% of our respondents used 2FA. Now, I should note that we didn't necessarily just ask people, what do you use 2FA? We first went through and defined a lot of the common implementations. So describing sort of, have you gotten an SMS message code texted to your phone that you then use to log in after a password, describing on-device authenticators. And so we made sure that the respondents were aware of all of the terminology before going into these questions. And it turned out that 53% were actively using 2FA, and then 77% were familiar with the concept. So maybe they hadn't enrolled themselves, but their bank or another service provider had given them that option, and they were aware of it as a security mechanism. The next few slides, I'll cover who is using 2FA, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the single best predictor of 2FA use of any of the dimensions that we collected on our respondents was their self-reported knowledge of information security. So those who reported being unfamiliar with information security used 2FA at a rate of only about 22%, but those who described having expert-level knowledge had a rate of 83% usage. So still even some room for improvement at the self-reported information security experts. But you can see that trend well aligns with what our expectations would be. The other strong predictor of whether an individual respondent had used 2FA or not was age. And so the highest adoption occurred in the age group 18 years to about 34 years. Those are pretty neck and neck with the 18 to 24-year-olds and the 25 to 34-year-olds. And then it declines as the age increases of the survey respondent. There was other information that we also looked at. So ethnicity, things like that, showed no statistically significant relationship. And the other thing that was very interesting to us was there was not a statistical difference between the percentage of 2FA users and people who are aware of 2FA in the United States versus the United Kingdom. So we saw very similar response rates in both of the geographic regions that we targeted. For those people who had used 2FA, the majority of them said that they used it on some websites or for some accounts, but not all of them. The reasons that they gave for that were most commonly that they felt like they protected their most important accounts or most valuable accounts with 2FA, but had some that they didn't really care about, and so they didn't put a second factor on. 57% report voluntary adoption. This was a repeat finding from the 2017 survey, and sort of surprised me both then and now. But other reasons that people adopted it were because they had to, due to their employer policy or a university policy, maybe. And then the number one reason that people used 2FA and then stopped using it was because they thought it was inconvenient. So this might be a little tricky to see, but this goes through some of the attributes of specific 2FA factors that we collected. This is all about the experience of logging in. We asked for SMS text messaging, push notifications, security keys, as well as hardware tokens, email links, and phone calls. That we asked them to rate for the ones that they'd used, the convenience, the quickness, how much they enjoyed that particular factor, whether they'd use it again, and sort of a list of different statements that they can agree with or disagree with based on all of the factors that they had experience using. And this was really useful as well to us. It gave us insight into factor-specific authentication experience, and as well as factor-specific adoption rates. And so the most popular, by most popular, I mean the one that the most people had used was SMS messaging at 71%. And then the second most common was email. So you can see sort of an artifact of a lot of the earliest second factor methods have remained some of the more popular ones. SMS in particular was very popular. It was widely rated as the most convenient. So people described liking being able to use a device that they already had on them to authenticate. But actually, even though security key had one of the lower adoption rates, so that was about 12%, it was rated the highest among those who had used it for both enjoyment and for perceived security. So that's good news. Yes, so this is a graph that you can refer back to in the slides describing sort of what I was just saying about the prevalence of various auth factors. We see SMS has sort of a commanding lead, but mobile app takes third, phone call still around at fourth, then push, security keys, and hardware tokens. And actually, hardware tokens suffered the greatest decline in usage rate from the 2017 survey into 2019. They were also rated lowest as far as convenience and people enjoying using them. So not a very popular method, but it is on the decline. Then SMS messaging also had the highest agreement for the statement, using it was quick, which is sort of interesting because third-party studies have shown that push notifications allow the user to authenticate on average 5 seconds faster. And U2F tokens, so security keys, offer a faster authentication by about 7 seconds on average. So this is sort of a misconception on the part of users. And our team made a nice little infographic about how the average user could save about 20 minutes a year by switching to a security key. Although if you're working in a tech field and authenticating often, that number could be a lot higher depending on the number of authentications and two-factor protected systems that you're accessing. We also wanted to find out more about, even for those who weren't really familiar with two-factor as a concept or described themselves as unfamiliar with information security in general, what they perceived their online risk to be and how they thought about the value of a lot of their online accounts. And so one of the questions that we asked were for respondents to select both the online accounts that they had and the ones they found or they thought were the most valuable. And so it's not really surprising that banking and financial accounts took the lead at 82%. But what is kind of surprising to me, at least, is, and this doesn't add up to 100 because they could select more than one, in case you were wondering. But communications accounts, including email, was far behind. And in a lot of cases, which I'll get to later, email is considered by security professionals to be the most important, only because it's a backup mechanism for a lot of these other accounts. So it could, in fact, lead to a waterfall effect of losing several additional accounts in tandem with the email. So to summarize, banking and financial accounts warranted the most concern. media and entertainment accounts warranted the least. We thought that an interesting element of this was that entertainment accounts are among the most likely to be shared. So what's surprising is Netflix, although having a sort of well-known, sophisticated tech team, I do not believe currently supports, two-factor authentication. It at least did not at the time of the release of our report last month. Spotify, similar, where they have a lot of great engineering talent, but don't offer two-factor authentication. Another kind of fun factoid from our security behaviors section was that only 7% of folks said that they tended to repeat passwords. So this is also, someone shouted lies. This is an example of what we call the limitations of having self-reported behavior, especially with sort of a halo effect of people knowing what they're supposed to answer. But I'll add that an independent study of password dumps, so like the dumps of credentials across various websites, estimated the rate of password reuse to be at least 40 to 45%. One of the questions that we really want to ask, I hope this wasn't it, in a future iteration of this survey is about password managers and the behavior there. But overall, people reported in both the United States and United Kingdom sort of a general perception of account safety and generally positive reporting of security behaviors. So people agreed in large numbers with the statement, I think mostly my accounts are secure. I'm not worried about malicious access or unauthorized access to my accounts. So there are a few takeaways which I'll get to, one of which, again, is that we may be, or the general public may underestimate the damage of losing access to their email account, as that is such a common backup mechanism for other accounts, including ones that they're most concerned about, like financial accounts. Other takeaways, both awareness and adoption of two-factor authentication have increased significantly, even just in the past 2 years. According to users, they want their 2FA to be as convenient as possible, as fast as possible, and they like it if it's with devices they already have. And our users, our survey respondents, were attuned to online risks. They might have exaggerated some of their password hygiene, for example, but they were certainly aware of the risks involved, especially those financial risks. And one of the things that we can do as a community to encourage adoption of multi-factor is to emphasize convenience. So there are a couple new methods like WebAuthn and passwordless that are sort of coming out, and maybe to encourage that adoption at a higher rate, we can sort of emphasize how convenient and quick those could be. And even with that password exaggeration, we know that users know what security behaviors look like and should be. But in some cases, the demonstration of the value of actually taking the time to do those may be lacking. And so this is just a way to think about getting through to your average user who may or may not be as aware and as concerned with protecting access. And that's all I have for y'all, but if you're interested, I included the link to the full report that we put out last month that has more data on some of the questions that we asked. And I'm happy to take questions in the Slack channel or now.
Okay. Thank you very much. All right, we have about 10 minutes for questions. So, Jonathan, you had a question first, so it was in the Slack channel.
So you talked about convenience and speed, and it seemed like those were separate questions, but maybe they're also conflated with each other? Like, is there a way to separately measure their like annoyance at the inconvenience of having to carry another item for the token, rather? Because you made the point that like it's weird that they think that the phone is more convenient even though it's slower.
Right. Right. So those were considered as separate items in our survey. They were two sort of different ratings that we asked people to give. And so the speed is kind of an objective thing, and those numbers about how much time saved, that's purely from timing the length of authentications. But convenience is more of a user perception, and so the convenience numbers that I showed were all results from the survey and purely what people said about their experience.
So you didn't ask them how fast they thought it was?
Yes, we also asked them how fast. So there was using it was convenient and using it was fast. And people, so actually, yeah, and I think one of the points was that people thought or perceived SMS to be faster than it was. So speed was also on the survey, but that's a situation where we have the actual data to compare to.
So is there a way to tell whether they thought about the speed of finding the token, going to look for it, versus what the empirical things measure, which is, okay, you have both of these things in your hand. Which one is faster?
I think you're asking if there's a way to tell what they were considering in their evaluation, and in which case, no, we don't have any more sort of qualitative, like interviewed data, although that would be certainly interesting to figure out what they considered the speed or like part of the authentication process. Yes.
So for the respondents, did you notice a difference between like age groups? I don't know if you guys captured age, but like, did you guys notice that people who were of younger age actually responded like, to using two-factor like more than someone of an older age? Yes.
So I think actually I have a graph that is by age. If
I may have missed that. Sorry.
Speed through it. Yeah.
Okay.
Here. So this is what I was talking about. We see the 18 to 34 has the highest adoption, and then it sort of declines as you increase the age group, with obvious exceptions.
And I had a follow-up question on that one in particular, which is, does it happen to match cell phone adoption or smartphone adoption by age group as well?
That's a great question, and something that we would have to supplement external data to compare to, but that would be cool.
So you had a slide where you showed the improvement between the previous version of this survey, and it went from like 28% usage to 53 or something like that. Is there any specific single thing that was responsible for a big spike? Like, I know Apple now, if you don't have two-factor, you get a notification on your screen all the time. Like, do you know if anything was responsible for like 10% increase there, or it's general?
So because we only have sort of these point-in-time estimates, we don't have the percentage of adoption rate over that time period. So it's kind of hard to narrow down to like, in this particular month it spiked or anything like that. We talked about a lot of potential sort of reasons for this increase, which is sizable, as you mentioned. I think a lot of it is just sort of industry-wide, starting to require it more, starting to incorporate it into an enrollment flow when you're signing up for more services. But no, we don't have sort of a particular event that caused anything.
Thank you.
So in some usage patterns, on-device biometrics like Touch ID and Face ID serve sort of as a second factor. Did you include those in your surveys at all?
We did not include biometrics in this survey, or like the Touch ID and Face ID. We actually did measure. We measured the increase in devices that have Touch ID or Face ID capabilities in a separate report on Duo specific data, but this one was more about a general population sort of usage, and we didn't ask about it in this one.
by the way, that was Bob. Make sure you introduce yourselves, okay? So did I understand that correctly in that if an app uses Touch ID or Face ID, that is not considered 2FA?
Only that we did not use that factor or ask about that factor in. So I think it would be considered 2FA in many scenarios where where you're logging in, or you can add a step of verification with a fingerprint, but we didn't ask about those sort of device level factors.
Well, I guess the specific follow-up, what the specific angle I was taking was, does the survey respondents realize that Face ID and and Touch ID are essentially a 2FA?
I don't think that, because we didn't include it sort of within our factors that we described and sort of went through, I don't think that respondents would necessarily count Touch ID or Face ID usage as part of their response. I also think it would be tricky to tell or to sort of differentiate the context in which either of those were 2FA versus just a sort of authentication or like a single factor authentication.
Yeah, okay, hi, my name is George, I'm with Capital One. So that gentleman more or less stole my thunder. My question was going to be about biometrics and concerns regarding privacy. But I can take advantage of that and mention things like, when you want to enable two-factor, you have to give sometimes your cell phone number or some additional data to enable that to happen. Is there any way you've captured any concern around privacy at all?
Yeah, and actually we did. That didn't make these slides, although I think it might be in the full report. We also asked people who either stopped using 2FA or who did not use 2FA why, who had heard of it, that is. And many people, one of the reasons was like a perceived sort of invasion of privacy. And people did report, for example, not using SMS 2FA because they didn't want to give that service their phone number.
Hi, my name is Manbir. So one quick question is, I didn't see it on there, but did you guys consider cost as a part of the user experience? And the reason being is that with a security key, it's an additional cost, whereas versus SMS or a phone, it's a built-in cost already, or no additional cost in perceived cost even?
That's a great question. We did not include cost. A lot of people at Duo were interested in that, especially from an administrator perspective. But as far as like our end user survey, we did not include cost.
Francis Finley. In future ones, if you plan to do any future ones, are you going to be looking at any other culturally different areas? US and UK tend to be very culturally similar in how they use the internet. Would there be differences in other regions?
There certainly could be, and of course, we're unable to tell with the data that we collected. We selected those regions largely because, one, we wouldn't have to worry about translating the survey, and also because they're sizable markets for us, and so sort of the information was obviously of interest. But I definitely think that expanding this geographically could yield some interesting results, but I can't really hypothesize as to what.
Okay, so we have about a minute before the next session. I wanted to give a way to frame a framework for how we discuss 2FA. So the whole point of the conversation was around 2FA adoption. When would people want to use 2FA? And in the chat, I mentioned something along the lines of there are certain types of services where people will not want to use 2FA because if it's primarily a consumption-based one like Netflix or Spotify, in fact, I don't want to even use a username and password. I want it to be more like TV and radio where I just turn it on and I get it, right? In other cases where it's less consumption-based and I have to put something in, like my bank account, then I absolutely want 2FA, right? And so I think this notion of if we look at services along that spectrum of how much is it more consumption-based versus production-based, I'm not sure what the counterpart is, but it would seem to me that there is some sort of view that there's a tipping point at which point you would say 2FA becomes much more of a stronger value proposition to the user because you're now moving into a pure consumption based into something where you're contributing, right? So anyway, I'm just trying to provide a framework for how you might think about if you were to follow up with a discussion on this with the group to define what that might look like. Okay?
Sure.
Make sense?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Maggie.